Alright guys, the video you've all been waiting for, forging a knife from a bunch of ground up steel. So what we have here is a bunch of ground up steel, and you can see a little bit of rust in there as well, which is not going to be good. This is mostly 01 tool steel, I think. There's some 15N20, some 1095, and some 1060. So we're going to try to mix it up as well as we can and get some kind of, mixture there. I didn't really do any concessions that I would normally do when it comes to grinding. I had knives to grind, so that's what I did. And collected the waste. And as you're continually keeping your blades cool in water, you get water dripped onto the this waste material, and it results in some rust. And so that's just kind of how it goes. So we're gonna stick all of this into a canister and see if we can forge weld something that is at least reasonably functional. Okay, so we have our can ready, and this is the key to even marginal success in this project. But it's 3 inches long approximately, 2 by 2 inch steel square tubing. Got a cap weld on the end here, another cap ready to weld on. We've got white paint on the inside to keep this from welding to this, so we can get it out and work with it from there. My highest expectation for this project is to get sort of a forge welded piece that has a bunch of inclusions and nasty stuff in it. That's kind of my greatest expectation here. So I'm not, putting super high, I want to get this mixed up a little better, I guess. But I don't have super high expectations for this at all. But I do want to get this 01 and the 15N20 and the 1060, all of that sort of homogenized a little bit, so that we can benefit as much as possible from the different strengths of the different steel. So anyway, we're just going to pack this full, and maybe I should have made a bigger can. What was I thinking? I don't know. Maybe this will be enough for like a second try if this one totally fails. I'm not sure. I'm going to pack this in here as tight as I possibly can. Look at all that rust powder coming off of there. So I'm envisioning perhaps that we'll forge weld this up and then take it out of the can, and then maybe further refine it like a ancient piece of primitive steel like they used to do eons ago. We'll see what happens. That doesn't look super promising. All that rust just coming off of that. It's important to note that this is not steel powder. It's tiny shavings, and so because of that, there's a lot. If you just put it in here, there's a lot of extra space because it doesn't just pack down. Alright, so we've got this in the forge. We've had it in there for probably 15-20 minutes soaking. Make sure that it's up to a nice welding key. That's the nice thing about canisters. You don't have to worry about decarb. You don't have to worry about ruining your steel otherwise. And so let's pull this out and squish it and see what happens. Okay, well, I will say that did feel really squishy when we put it in the press here. Even though I packed that down, tamped that down as well as I could, that's not a very dense material as it sits. So we'll heat it back up a few more times and squish it and try to get some solidity to it. And then we're gonna have to take it out of the can and see what we can do with it after that. Alright guys, well, I don't know. I'm not sure what we have here. It kind of felt like these shavings are basically flopping around inside there, like kind of like a hacky sack that the cool kids had 20 years ago. And so I was able to forge it down with the flat dies, back and forth, and then I kind of forged on the corner. So I think we kind of have like a balloon now where there's something inside there. I don't know how solid it is or anything like that, but I'm gonna let it cool down for a minute and then we'll open it up. Alright guys, well, that's what I would call basically a complete failure. Obviously, those little shavings particles failed to weld together throughout the entire piece. I'm not even sure if these chunks here are necessarily welded together, or if they just happen to be sticking together. I don't know. That feels fairly solid, I guess. So maybe we sort of achieved some forge welding on a small scale, but obviously the overall integrity of that is horrible, of course. So I guess the question remains, could you take these terrible chunks that are somewhat holding together and then attempt to forge weld those together and eventually create some usable form of steel? Probably, but it's still obviously going to be inferior, vastly inferior. So I'm not going to even attempt that. We don't have enough here really to do anything like that in the first place. So this was an interesting experiment, but there's several reasons why I think this might have failed. Alright, so with our failed experiment, let's take a little bit of time to talk about metallurgy, because it's fun and it's something we can do to sort of redeem this process and maybe learn something. So there's several reasons why this failed, I think. Now, I don't know which one it was specifically or if it was all of these together, so let's talk about all of them and we'll just have to leave the rest up to conjecture. But first of all, you saw that the rust powder you know, puffing off of the steel shavings, grindings as I was tamping them down. That's oxidization. That's the worst thing one of the worst things for a forge weld, right? So that's why we use flux in forge weld. That's why we put stuff in a canister. All these things to prevent oxidization. Rust is a form of oxidization. That's why we clean our steel carefully when we do a Damascus billet, you know, pattern welded steel billet. And so that oxidization permeated throughout that entire, you know, bit of steel that we had, I'm sure was very detrimental to the forging process. I knew it wasn't going to be good. I didn't know how bad it was going to be. Another thing that you have to keep in consideration with this particular material is that when you're grinding, the metal is not the only thing that's coming off of that process. You're using abrasive belts, and the abrasives, whether it's aluminum oxide or ceramic belts or whatever it is, those are breaking down as you're using them, and so we invariably have a, you know, whatever level of concentration of abrasive dust in that canister of grindings that we were trying to forge weld together, and those are not going to forge weld together either. Now, sometimes you'll run into where you're doing a pattern welded steel billet, and if you're, you know, cleaning up the steel, sometimes little pieces of abrasive can get embedded into the steel, and at times you'll find those as you finish your blade, and there's a little tiny pockmark. It's because that little piece of abrasive just sat there. It's not going to weld to the steel. It's not going to go away. And so if we have a high quantity, or, you know, an appreciable quantity of small tiny pieces of abrasives mixed in with that steel shavings, then that's going to present another issue. Thirdly, most of those steel shavings were 01 tool steel. The only reason for that is I typically do my 01 tool steel blades in a stock removal, partly because of the form of the material that I get, and also partly because I don't like to forge it. It's a steel that doesn't necessarily lend itself as well to forging as other steels such as 1095 or 5200, and you have to be very careful at the temperatures that you forge it at. 01 tool steel is prone to a condition that's known as red short or hot short, and that is if you get it up to a certain temperature, you know, a red hot or what might be perceived as orange hot by some people, it becomes brittle. It can become brittle and crack. And so you can be forging your piece of 01 tool steel blade, you know, knife steel, and make a blade and have a crack that you don't know about until later in the process, and it can be due to this red short or hot short condition. Now, if you're very careful with your temperature control, you can do all kinds of things with 01 tool steel, and some people do. It's a great steel if used properly, just as with any other steel. Personally, I don't like to forge it, so it's kind of ironic that I would attempt to use it for forge welding together a conglomerate of steel grindings, but I did because that's what I had. And that could have definitely contributed to the issues that we had here, the red short or hot short condition, because we did have it up to a good welding temperature, and I don't know exactly what that was, so I don't know if that was adversely affecting the 01 tool steel and causing a red short problem. So there you have it. There's three different reasons why it might have failed, or maybe it was all three. If you guys have an idea as to why this experiment failed, throw a comment down there. Let me know. It's all a learning process. I think it could be done for sure. I think you'd have to be a lot more careful about keeping your grindings clean and dry, and I probably wouldn't use 01. So there you have it, guys. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video.